In earlier episodes on this channel, I've discussed the career arc of the 1970s progressive rock superstars Emerson, Lake, and Palmer at length, going back to the band's formation in 1969 and 1970, working through the heyday of the band through the early and mid-70s, and most recently discussing their return from a 2-year hiatus with their albums Works Volume 1 and Works Volume 2, and their return to the road in 1977 and 1978 to support those albums. In this episode, I'm going to pick up the story and discuss the last several months of Emerson, Lake, and Palmer's career. Specifically, I'll discuss the making of their last studio album, 1978's Love Beach, their live album, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer in Concert, recorded during the Works tours in 1977 and 78 and released in 1979, and their album, The Best of Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, a greatest hits album released following the dissolution of the band in 1980. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer's tour in support of Works Volume 1 was, from the outset, planned to be a massive one in scope. And as it turned out, by the tour's end, it would be much longer than originally planned and much more massive from a financial perspective. The original plan for the tour was that it would be an international tour touching over 90 cities, and that the tour at each stop would feature Emerson, Lake, and Palmer backed by a live orchestra. The idea for this came largely from Keith Emerson. Keith Emerson had, as part of Works Volume 1, featured his Piano Concerto No. 1, which made use of orchestration, and the band on Works Volume 1, in their keystone track for the album, Pirates, made use of full orchestration as well. While it was recognized from the beginning that making use of a full orchestra was going to be quite expensive, the band and their manager, Stuart Young, went along with the idea. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer's making use of the full orchestra on the road for this tour lasted for 14 dates before it was recognized that it was financially impractical to continue with the full orchestra in tow. At one point, the band was on the verge of bankruptcy. Greg Lake had stated in subsequent interviews following the breakup of Emerson, Lake, and Palmer that at one point the band was over $3 million in the red and were hemorrhaging money. It was decided that the orchestra would be dispensed with and used for only the most strategic dates on the tour, specifically dates in New York City and at Olympic Stadium in Montreal, where it was planned that the concerts would be recorded for use for a future live album. Once the orchestra was dismissed, out of necessity, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer needed to change their tour program in order to make up for the fact that certain songs could not be played in the same form without the orchestra present. They also added additional songs that did not require an orchestra, some of which had not yet been released to the general public. To compensate for that, ELP, some 7 months after Works Volume 1 came out, released Works Volume 2, which included many of these additional tracks. They also, as a means of trying to recoup some of their losses, extended the length of the tour by some 3 months, adding another 40-plus dates to the tour itinerary. ELP's tour for Works Volume 1 and Works Volume 2 ended in March of 1978, after nearly 140 dates. The tour got them to where they basically broke even at its end. Not exactly a great result considering that the two albums that they supported on the tour, Works 1 and Works 2, had both gone gold. By the tour's end, there was significant disenchantment, I might even go so far as to say acrimony, within the world of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Greg Lake and Carl Palmer put the responsibility for the tour's failure on Keith Emerson's shoulders. It was Emerson, after all, that had insisted that he wanted to tour with the orchestra. Greg Lake was particularly incensed at the issues around the tour for a number of reasons. Financially, of course, he expected that there would be much more of a windfall from the tour. But it went further than that for Greg. Greg Lake had, prior to the release of Works Volume 1, wanted to pursue the release of a solo album, the plans for which were scotched when the decision was made to take the tracks that he had recorded for his solo album, as well as tracks that Emerson and Palmer had recorded, and consolidate them into the Works Volume 1 package. He was also not happy for other reasons. In doing the work on his solo album and ultimately on Works Volume 1 and Volume 2, Greg Lake was now sharing his songwriter credits with Pete Sinfield, who had been invited to work with the band and who ultimately took a share of the band's revenue, starting with the Brain Salad Surgery era in late 1973 and into the 1974 tour that supported that album. Where Lake and Sinfield had at one time been firm friends, that friendship now was beginning to erode, given the lack of success of the Works albums and the fact that Sinfield's income was basically coming out of Lake's share. Finally, Greg Lake had effectively lost his producer's credit in the course of making of the Works albums. While all of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's early albums had some level of participation from all the members of the band on production details, Greg Lake had the final say and was given producer's credit on all of the early albums the band made. That is to say, the band's first 4 studio albums, plus the live albums, Pictures at an Exhibition, and Welcome Back, My Friends. That producer's credit and the royalties that went with it at this point in time were no longer guaranteed. Where Greg Lake had felt in late 1975, with the release of his solo single, I Believe in Father Christmas, that he could leverage his stardom with ELP and his success now with that single into a major solo career, he was now contemplating his fortunes within ELP, a band that looked like it was beginning its decline. While both Works Volume 1 and Works Volume 2 had gone gold as far as certification in the United States was concerned, those albums did not perform as well as the albums of ELP's heyday. Works Volume 1 made it to number 12 on the Billboard charts, certainly a respectable showing. Works Volume 2, however, did not do as well. It only made it to number 37 on the US Billboard charts. That, coupled with the fact that Works Volume 2 contained several older tracks from the band, began making not only fans but the critics think that maybe ELP were on the downside of their career. With this frame of mind, the band felt that the best thing to do at this time was to take a break and determine how to best go forward. Keith Emerson would, in an article he wrote several years later, following the dissolution of ELP in 1980 for Contemporary Keyboard magazine, stated that the band had discussed breaking up at this time, or at the very least, changing their approach radically simplifying it to where they possibly would go forward with just piano, bass, and drums as their instrumentation. The band, however, was not going to be given a chance to regroup. In the spring of 1978, shortly after the Works tour ended, ELP, along with their manager Stuart Young, were called to a meeting with the head of their record label, Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun. At this meeting, Ertegun made it clear to the band that he was looking for the band to quickly get a new album out for the label. The band were not ready to go forward with an album at this time. They were still exhausted from the tour and had no music written in reserve that they could take to a studio and begin work on immediately. Greg Lake countered, asking for the opportunity to record his long-awaited solo album. That was apparently politely rebuked by Ertegun, who reminded the band that there was still one studio album remaining on the contract that ELP had signed with Atlantic in 1976, and that he wanted that album delivered and delivered quickly. Ertegun was something of a psychologist at heart, and he recognized that Greg Lake always had something of a commercial bent when it came to how he viewed the approach that the band should take. And he made the suggestion that the band should consider a more overt commercial path in cutting their next album. By early 1978, the bands from the progressive rock heyday were beginning to disappear from the charts. And the prog rock mantle at that point was beginning to be taken by the so-called arena rock bands that emerged in the middle portion of the decade. Bands like, for example, the Electric Light Orchestra, Styx, Boston, Kansas, and Rush. These bands maintained a progressive edge to their music, but were much more open to recording some songs of shorter, more radio-friendly length. And it was this approach that Ertegun asked ELP to consider in putting a new album together, an album that he wanted soon. Keith Emerson was reluctant as far as the commercial bent for the album that Ertegun was requesting, but he was willing to compromise and give Greg Lake his head on at least part of the selections in order to satisfy Ertegun's request. He also made note to Ertegun that Chris Blackwell, the owner of Island Records, had recently opened a recording studio in Nassau in the Bahamas, where Emerson and his family were now living, having taken on tax exile status from the UK a couple of years before. And Emerson suggested that Blackwell's Compass Point Studios could be a good location for the band to get together and work on new songs. Ertegun agreed and booked time at Compass Point. Greg Lake and Stuart Young would purchase property in Nassau in order to support the sessions. Carl Palmer moved there as well, although he rented property rather than purchasing. The first sessions in Nassau moved slowly. The band didn't have anything new to record, and it was generally, in any event, Greg Lake's approach that he would only start composing for an album in the studio itself. Because of the slow movement and the studio time effectively being wasted, Stuart Young made the choice to invite Pete Sinfield down to join ELP at Compass Point to work on the album. This is probably not a decision that Greg Lake relished. It meant that he'd be sharing his songwriting credits yet again, but I would imagine that he wasn't given very much choice in the matter, given the lack of progress that was being made in the early sessions. Greg Lake and Pete Sinfield are credited as writing 5 songs on the album that would become known as Love Beach. These songs, by comparison to Emerson, Lake and Palmer's earlier output, are much more light in their composition. Most of them are very short. Only one of the 5 songs goes in excess of 4 minutes. 2 of them are under 3 minutes and almost seem crafted for single length, those 2 being the album's title track, Love Beach, and the song that opens the album, All I Want Is You. It's debatable to what degree Pete Sinfield contributed to the lyrics on these songs. He is co-credited, but as I said, that could be contractual. The structure of most of the songs that Lake is credited for on Love Beach is such that I would think that Greg Lake wrote quite a few of the lyrics for the songs as well. Greg Lake always had a tendency to write songs in a folk-oriented style with adjoining couplets rhyming, and that's the structure that tends to be used on these songs on the Love Beach album. One of the songs on the album, Taste of My Love, is one that is downright embarrassing. I don't know whether it was Greg Lake or Pete Sinfield that thought it would be a good idea to cram in a ton of innuendos about oral sex into an Emerson, Lake and Palmer song. But they did, and the instrumentation that goes with the song is equally cheesy. Listen to, for example, the simulated French horn that Emerson provides when Greg Lake sings, "Jump on my stallion and we'll ride." Good grief. There are 2 songs of the 5 that Lake and Sinfield provided to the album that are relatively strong. One, The Gambler, is the only song of the Lake songs that features a full-blown keyboard solo from Keith Emerson. And here I would say that where Greg Lake's commercial instincts generally were good, Greg Lake the performer neglected to consider, as Greg Lake the producer, that he had one of the premier instrumentalists in the world, Keith Emerson, at his disposal. Not using Emerson more judiciously on the songs that he wrote to provide instrumental background and solos is a critical mistake in terms of how these songs are constructed, at least in my opinion. The other song, For You, also features Emerson, although at the top of the song, providing an introduction. And again, this is good, but it's nowhere near enough of Emerson to please the fan. The other 2 songs on Love Beach are largely there at Emerson's behest. The first of these, which ends side 1 of the album, which is effectively the Greg Lake side, is Emerson, Lake and Palmer's interpretation of Canario, the final movement of Joaquin Rodrigo's Fantasia para un Gentilhombre, a piece that he wrote for Andres Segovia in 1954. Rodrigo, in many ways, was considered as the Spanish Aaron Copland, and of course Aaron Copland figured quite prominently in Emerson, Lake and Palmer's earlier tunes, Hoedown from Copland's Rodeo Suite, as well as Fanfare for the Common Man. Rodrigo was known not only to Spanish audiences, but to American audiences. His Concerto de Aranjuez was adapted in 1960 by Miles Davis for Davis's landmark album Sketches of Spain, and dominates that album in a large way. ELP do a wonderful job with Canario, and it's a song that ultimately would have a life unto itself some years later as part of the repertoire of Carl Palmer's band. Side 2 of the album is Keith Emerson's long-form piece, Memoirs of an Officer and a Gentleman, which Pete Sinfield provided lyrics to. Interestingly, Pete Sinfield apparently, by the time he began working with Emerson on lyrics for Memoirs, said that the only way he would be willing to go forward with lyrics for this piece is if he could provide them alone. His relationship with Lake had apparently gotten that strained. Upon completing recording, there was no rap party. To quote a later article in Contemporary Keyboard with Emerson, everybody, Emerson said, just wanted to get the hell out of Nassau. Greg Lake would leave to return home, but not before he and his wife Regina, according to Emerson's autobiography, took the opportunity to berate Emerson at length yet again for their financial difficulties stemming from the Works tour. Lake leaving in the manner he did meant that there was no way for him to participate with final production of the album, which left supervision of the album's mixdown to Keith Emerson. There is no producer credit on Love Beach. In his autobiography of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's work, Endless Enigma, the critic Ed McCann points out that in what Emerson did to bring Love Beach to market, that it would have been appropriate to credit Emerson as a salvager of the project rather than the producer. Emerson had produced albums before, particularly with The Nice, but this album needed to be delivered quickly, and I'm sure by the time that he was working on these final stages of the project, that Emerson wanted to get on with other business himself. In particular, he wanted to get the live album from the Works tour together for ultimate release as well. Love Beach would be released by Atlantic Records in the fall of 1978. It was successful enough that it reached gold album certification. It would be the last ELP album to be certified as gold. It, however, only reached number 55 on the Billboard charts. And it was savaged by the music press, particularly in the United States. Emerson would discover, upon moving on to work with the tapes from the Works Volume 1 and Works Volume 2 tours to assemble an album, that he didn't have all that much to work with, particularly when it came to the recordings of the orchestra. The multi-track tapes from the band's performances at Olympic Stadium in Montreal were flawed. Not all tracks were recorded properly. Apparently, the best rendering of the orchestra on some songs was a 2-track tape that was not in proper balance, but it was what Emerson had to work with. He ended up adding a few songs from the 1978 Works 2 portion of the tour, including the album's opener, ELP's version of Henry Mancini's Peter Gunn theme, as well as one of the songs from Works 2, Tiger in a Spotlight. Ironically, the two songs that I would dare say Emerson wanted to showcase on this new live album, Fanfare for the Common Man and Pirates, were not in very good shape. And in the original editions of the album that would become Emerson, Lake and Palmer in Concert, those tracks were not included. What was included, probably out of necessity, was an orchestrated version of Pictures in an Exhibition, which was not a bad performance by the band or by the orchestra, but was obviously somewhat superfluous. The original version of Pictures, recorded by Eddie Offord in March of 1971, was a wonderful version that most ELP fans already had in their collection. Emerson ideally wanted Emerson, Lake and Palmer in Concert to be a double album. He had enough material to stretch where he could have achieved 2 albums worth of material. Atlantic Records, however, would not allow him to do it. By the time of the winter of 1979, when Emerson was compiling the album, it was becoming clear to Atlantic Records that Emerson, Lake and Palmer were not likely to endure very much longer as a band. And Atlantic, as a result, wanted to hedge their bets and decided that if they were going to release this album, it would be a single album and not a double. And ultimately, Emerson agreed. Emerson, in the 1990s, would revisit the tapes from Montreal and recompile them into a double record set at last, Works Live, with the better technology for mixing and mastering that was available at that time. But Emerson, Lake and Palmer in Concert, in its original version, was not a success at all. The album barely made it into the top 100, did not go gold, and as I mentioned, suffered from substandard sound on the tracks that featured the orchestra. Not a strong showing, unfortunately. Certainly not what Emerson wanted this music to be remembered by the public as being. By the spring of 1979, word was getting out into the music press that Emerson, Lake and Palmer was not likely to continue. One article in the American magazine Circus indicated that Emerson, Lake and Palmer were going to regroup for one last farewell tour in 1979. And indeed, Carl Palmer worked with Emerson, Lake, and Stuart Young to try and make such a tour happen. Apparently put in about a month and a half or 2 months worth of effort trying to determine what songs to be played and how extensive the tour itinerary should be from an international perspective. Palmer, however, was not able to achieve agreement with Emerson and Lake on these issues, and the idea of a tour was quietly dropped. By the late summer of 1979, Palmer was beginning to work with a new group of musicians in the band that would eventually be known as PM. And as the word started getting out on that, Atlantic Records felt that they had no choice but to admit to the listening public that Emerson, Lake and Palmer were no more. And an announcement to that effect would be made in late 1979. Atlantic Records' final farewell to this initial incarnation of Emerson, Lake and Palmer would be in 1980 through the release of The Best of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, a compilation of the band's tracks. Given that so many of ELP's studio recordings were of epic proportions, including songs, for example, like Tarkus and the 29-minute long Carnival 9, putting a single album out that largely focused on the FM radio-friendly material by the band is, at least in my mind, not a proper way to say goodbye to this band. When Atlantic Records learned in the early 1990s that Emerson, Lake and Palmer were looking at regrouping, they rectified this error by putting out a double record collection of the best of the band's work, the so-called Atlantic Years collection. This album, however, was only available in the marketplace for about a year or so. As luck would have it for Atlantic, when ELP regrouped, they signed with a different label, Victory Records, and put their own best of box set out into the marketplace in 1993, The Return of the Manticore, which is also a fine collection of the band's work. The story of Emerson, Lake and Palmer obviously did not end in 1979. Keith Emerson and Greg Lake would work together again a few years later with the drummer Cozy Powell in Emerson, Lake and Powell. Following that, Emerson would work with Carl Palmer briefly, along with bassist Robert Berry in the group 3. And as I just mentioned, ELP would regroup in the 1990s for several years, although the new albums they made in that time frame were nowhere as near as successful as their earlier work. ELP is a band that obviously is very well remembered by fans of the classic progressive rock era. As I pointed out in another episode on this channel, I think it's a criminal shame that Emerson, Lake and Palmer are not enshrined in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I suspect that they are not likely to ever be at this point in time, given that Keith Emerson and Greg Lake are no longer with us, and that is a terrible shame. This is a band that were revolutionary in their time, as well as very successful. In the episode on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where I discuss this, I make the point that 50 million record buyers can't be wrong, and I stand by that. Emerson, Lake and Palmer were one of the giants of the prog rock era, and they should be properly remembered based on that contribution. That is all for this episode. I appreciate your watching and listening as always. Feel free to leave any comments you might have. Always appreciate those. Click like on the episode if you enjoyed this content. And If you haven't become a subscriber to PROG McCandy yet, please do that as well. We'll be back here with you soon. You take good care. Bye-bye.